All right, the yearly projection tab. It's actually one of the most frequent tabs that I go and visit after I have all of my information in. So off the top right here, operating assumptions. So we see a lot of yellow cells here. That means there's a lot of potential to change these numbers. First, we have our market rent growth. So we're assuming a 3% rent growth year over year in just the market rent. Then it shows kind of like per month, how much that is and how much we're raising rent per unit, the average rent a square foot. So it's showing that increase as well. Then our vacancy. This is probably the part that I might change the numbers. So year one, we have 10% vacancy. Year two, I might drop it down to 8%, 7%, and then once we're kind of stabilized, maybe it's gonna be 5% for the next 2 years. And that will affect our numbers up here. As you saw, those kind of dropped a little bit. Concessions, I leave that kind of at the 0.5%. Bad debt, it drops down to 1%. We could put maybe 2% year two if we think, a little bit rougher of a property. This is kind of a nicer property, so we're going to leave that at 1%. And then non-revenue units, I don't usually touch this number, but it's there in case we need to add anything in there. So right here, property rent growth per year is just showing how much we're actually raising rent each year per unit. Next is the operating revenue. So it's showing our gross potential rent for each year, how it's growing each year based off of the market rent and any renovations that we add to the property. It's showing our loss to lease, and we can see it's going a downward trend, which is great. And then it kind of goes back up year 5 because at that point, market rent's going up and we're not raising rents a whole lot besides just market. So, we can see we're gaining back that lost income. And it just goes through gross scheduled rent, vacancy, concessions, bad debt, non-revenue units. That gives us our rental operating income, goes through utility reimbursement, other income. Now these factor percentages are our growth percentages, what we think it's going to grow year over year. So income, we do about 2%, or 2 to 3%. And then down here we have our expenses laid out. Taxes, we account for about 5% increase, and then the rest about 2%. And here you can change these numbers as well. If you think you're in a market that maybe expenses are increasing a bunch, here is where you can, account for that to be more conservative and so forth. I don't ever actually change. I haven't actually changed these numbers yet. But if you need to, you can here. That gives us our NOI every year. So kind of how we're performing each year. Also shows what our debt payments are and how that goes out. So we have 3 years of interest only payments. So it's showing that 3 years of $600,000. And then after that, we start paying the debt service of $929,000. That's including the principal and interest. And then the last part is our cash flow. So it's showing how much cash flow we're receiving each year, which is a very important number. I pay attention to that because this next section right here is actually my favorite. I look at preferred return for investors. Here we get to play with these numbers on what our preferred return for investors are going to be, whether that's 6%, 8%, and so forth. This is where we play with those numbers. Now you can see in year one, I have it shows 4%. It's actually at 3.5% because usually year one, the first 2 quarters, we don't do any distributions to our investors, except if it's a really good property and has really good cash flow off the bat. We usually first 2 quarters we won't distribute any profits. So I cut it in half to 3.5% and 7% after that. So I'm going to go into detail in explaining this part because I work on this part a lot and pay attention to it to know what our investors get and see if the deal actually makes sense. So initial equity contribution. So remember, it's a $10,000 acquisition fee. So that's what we're raising from our investors. They get 3.5 year one. Let's actually look at year 2 here. So they're getting that 7%. So $700,000 they're receiving first. That's being pulled out of that $929,000 $21,000 in cash flow. So we're getting $700,000 in distributions. Then there's only $220,000 remaining. Now the managers, us managers, we need to get our split, which is about 30% of that $900,000 in cash flow. But there's only $220,000 left, so we take that, and then we're still short about $55,000, and so we're going to account for that. We don't have a lot of cash flow in this deal right now, so that $55,000, it's actually going to add up along with the rest of these reds. And if we come over here, we have $247,000 in cash flow that us managers missed out on because we're making sure our investors were paid first. So we're gonna receive that catch up later at the sale of the property. Or if there's a chance that you're receiving a lot of extra cash flow later on throughout the other years, you can start getting that back before doing a 30-70 split with your investors. So we have that $55,000 we make up. Your total investor cash flow split, they get that $700,000. Now year 3 is a good example where we can see, they got their $700,000. There's almost $400,000 left over. Our 30% cut is only $350,000, which means that there's about $50,000 extra that we get a split between us and the investors, which is a 30-70 split. So the investors got a little extra money there. So instead of just getting a 7% return that year, they got a 7.5%, which is sweet. But us managers also gained some extra cash flow as well. And then we can see what the total project cash and cash is, and then the investor equity sale annualized. So this is important. I like to look at this a lot. It helps me see how our cash flow is. Now this deal, I probably, as we can see up here, the numbers didn't look great, but here we can see our cash flow is not great either. So I'd be concerned about this deal because we're able to pay our investors, but us managers are kind of hurting throughout the whole hold of the property. So that would be a concern to me as well. Now, if we continue down, we can end up seeing what the annual return is. So that's at 14%. That's actually up here. That's where it pulls from, is right here. And that 70%, we can see that we have it in our top section, is pulling from right here as well. If we scroll down, we just have down here some cash flow. So it's showing the total cash flow monthly, it's showing the quarterly, showing the investors, and then it's also showing the manager's cash flow. So what your cash flow would be on the GP side monthly. So that's kind of helpful, so we can see how much maybe we're getting each month and each quarter. So that's the yearly projection tab. I use it a lot. I really like it. And hopefully that helps when you're looking at deals that look at their cash flow. Next, we'll go over the returns tab and the importance of that one.